Joining us from New York is the former White House communications director under Donald Trump, Anthony Scaramucci. Thanks very much for joining us. So how do you think your former boss, President Trump, is doing with this crisis?
Well, I don't want to be a Monday morning quarterback and judge him with hindsight. I would say about 9 or 10 days ago, he made a 180-degree turn, which I think is very favorable. Governor Cuomo said yesterday in his press conference that he's getting a lot of help from the president. And so I think as a group of people, we all have to pull together, no matter what our disagreements are right now. I do wish, though, that the president had listened to the pandemic experts and the people at NIH, the National Institute of Health, and started putting these protocols in place in February, because then the lines of contagion in the United States would have looked very similar to South Korea or Singapore. But we're going to go through the worst part of this in New York in probably 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah. And it's very bad now. We look like a war zone here.
Yeah, but he is now throwing money at it. He's extending the shutdown, and he's doing what most world leaders seem to be doing now, isn't he?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think his press conference on Sunday, there was a sigh of relief up here in New York, because in the prior week, he was talking about returning the economy back to full activity after Easter Sunday or on Easter Sunday. And I think he got word from his people that that would probably lead to several 100,000 deaths, which we don't want here. I think the CDC projection right now, given that 75% of the population is being isolated, is something like 80,000 deaths. Think of the tragedy of that. We're hoping and praying that we can keep this thing suppressed. My good friend, Governor Cuomo's younger brother, Chris Cuomo, who's a commentator on CNN, has the virus and is self-quarantining in his house. So unfortunately now, if you live here in New York, you know people that have the virus. And even more tragically, you know people that have passed from the virus. You know them personally.
So what should, in your view, the president be doing that he's not doing?
Well, I mean, listen, I'm a big believer in a crisis. You go to the best people. And I would have done 3 things a little bit differently. Number one, I probably would have been more unified with the nation's governors. I would have probably been less sensitive or thin-skinned to whatever their reactions were. Number two, you've got places like Florida that have not really fully shut down, and there's a lot of elderly people in that population. I think the president could have used his moral suasion to get that locked down in a little bit more of a hurry. And I think of the last piece, we could discuss the stimulus. It's an okay stimulus, but we really needed to push more to the average wage earner. When we did the calculation, it was sort of $3,000 per adult and $1,500 per child, and they're way below that. And so I'm worried about that for the middle and lower middle class person in terms of their struggle as the economy reopens, and some of them may be out of jobs, and there'll be a transition period for them to find new jobs. So we could have probably done a little bit better on the stimulus for those people.
Now, as you say, in the city you live in, it's an appalling figure at the moment, a very grim situation there. Do you think that other American cities can now expect what New York is seeing now?
Well, listen, don't just go by me. Look at former FDA commissioner, a good friend of mine, Scott Gottlieb. You could look at these pandemic charts in the different cities. There are zones in the United States that have more than 5,000 cases now, and that's very bad because of the way this thing exponentially grows. So we have a problem in New Orleans, we have a problem in Detroit, possibly Atlanta and Miami, and in Northern California and Seattle. So there are problems ahead for the United States, and I hope that people will learn from what Governor Cuomo is doing, lock things down and keep them locked down a little bit longer. Don't react to this crisis. I think that we will learn with hindsight that an overreaction kept more people safe and, frankly, allowed for the economy to return back to its flourish in a much quicker period of time if we do these measurements right now and these containment measurements.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is listening to his top scientific advisor now, Tony Fauci. He said the other day, we had a strong argument with him, now he's listening.
Yeah, I believe that. I think that the numbers were overwhelming for the president. You know, one of the things the president tries to do, and it's unsuccessful here, you can't get to the microphone in the White House or in the Rose Garden and yell out fake science. You know, if 2 + 2 = 4, the president would have a very hard time, even with his most ardent supporters, convincing them that 2 + 2 is 7. And so this was an unusual crisis for this president. 45 years of his mannerisms and his communication style didn't really impact this crisis the way he thought it would. He wasn't able to curve the reality of the science to what he wanted it to be.
No, but his approval rating, I see today, is 49%, disapproval 45%. Only the second time in his presidency more people have approved than disapproved, and 60% approving his handling of the crisis.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all, because if you go back to the Gulf War with George Herbert Walker Bush, it was at 90%. He went and lost that election 8 or 9 months later. If you go through wartime situations in the United States, the proclivity is to rally around the flag and offer the support to the president. And so it'll be interesting to see what people remember in November in terms of the electoral prospects for the president. But I understand why those approval ratings are high. And I think as an American, and being a patriot first and a partisan deep last, I want him to do well in this crisis. I want him to be thinking clearly, and I want him to motivate these other cities to just take a look at what's going on in New York right now. And please listen to the public health care officials so that we can lock down those cities to prevent the tragedy, or at least the volume of the tragedy that's happening in New York right now. So I think I don't think there's any American that's for or against President Trump that doesn't want him to succeed right now.
OK, and just finally, in your city, Governor Cuomo is making something of an impact with these daily news conferences. People are already talking about him as a possible presidential contender. What do you make of that?
Well, you know, I grew up with Governor Cuomo. Chris and Andrew have been friends of mine for 40 years, which I'm sort of lying about my age now, as I don't like saying that, but he's one of my closest friends. He's a great guy. He is not an armchair general. He's out there on the front lines, and I pray for him every day because I know he's in touch with a lot of people that are infected with the disease. And so could he be president? Sure. He would be an amazing president. But he said very, very clearly one of his best friends in politics and his political mentor is Vice President Joe Biden. He endorsed him early, and I think he's going to put the full weight of his support and his newfound popularity and his very high approval rating. Let's just mention his while we're on the air. It's 87%.
Yeah, OK.
So I think there's a future presidency or opportunity in his future.
OK, we're going to lose the line. So thank you very much. But I wish the people of New York all the best in this crisis. Thanks very much, Anthony Scaramucci.
Thank you, sir.